Behind the closed doors of Nintendo and Game Freak, and really most developers of, like, anything, they will use secret code names to discuss projects that they don't want getting out to the public. Or in some cases, they simply need a name for the project while they still figure out what the project will be named once it is public. Maybe you remember the Nintendo NX from almost a decade ago. The name Nintendo NX got leaked as the project codename for what would eventually become the Nintendo Switch. But all Nintendo consoles had codenames before their real name was solidified. For example, the Wii was famously codenamed Revolution, referring to how motion controls were going to revolutionize gaming. During the development of the Nintendo 64, it was codenamed Project Reality. 3D graphics were a lot more realistic than 2D sprites after all. Even Pokémon's first home, the original Game Boy, was codenamed DMG for Dot Matrix Game, referring to how its rudimentary screen functioned. But the focus of today's video is not on Nintendo consoles, rather it's on the recently leaked codenames for Pokémon games past, current, and future, and what they even mean. Some of these codenames are straightforward. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet were codenamed Titan during development, likely referring to the Titan Pokémon this game introduced as boss battles. But others are not so simple to decode, with names like Beluga, Tart, Moe, Kenya, and Ikaku. This will involve some thinking. So let's start with the oldest game in the list and go mostly in order. The project that led to Pokémon Black 2 and White 2 was named Swan. So what does a swan have to do with these games? Well, there are a number of ways you could think of it. The most basic and obvious is that Gen 5 did introduce Swanna, the swan Pokémon, but it's pretty irrelevant to the games overall. Being the ace of one of the gym leaders is about as important as it gets. These games, like their predecessors, take place in the Unova region, which is based on New York City and some of its surrounding areas. This part of the country does have the densest population of mute swans, which themselves are black and white, though with orange beaks. We know that Game Freak's lead developers visit the areas that become regions ahead of time for research. Part of the documentation that leaked in the Teraleak includes touristy photos of Game Freak's trip to Hokkaido, surely research for Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. So perhaps during a trip to New York, someone was inspired by the dense swan population. Mute swans are very beautiful birds after all. But perhaps I'm thinking too literally. Let us consider the Black Swan theory. From the 2nd to the 16th centuries, this Latin phrase was a common figure of speech that came and went. A rare bird on Earth, very like a black swan. Swans, after all, have all white feathers, and they were common enough that everyone in classical Europe knew that. Swans are all white. Therefore, a black swan is something so impossibly rare. But, come 1697, a Dutch explorer discovered a whole species of black swans in Australia. Suddenly, the old saying doesn't work, and only happened due to the ignorance of the Europeans not knowing what was going on the other side of the world. Leading to today, the philosophical black swan theory is used as a metaphor that describes an event that comes as a surprise, has a major effect, and is rationalized after the fact with the benefit of hindsight, as well as the disproportionate role of high-profile, hard-to-predict, and rare events that are beyond the realm of normal expectations, which honestly describes Black 2 and White 2 perfectly. Every Pokémon generation up until this point has had their 2 games and then an improved 3rd game. It's just the way things had always been, and always would be. A Pokémon Gray or something akin to it would surely be coming. But when we got sequels announced instead, the game's journalism sites at the time exploded. Folks were dumbfounded by being proven wrong and went on to rationalize it with the power of hindsight, which is easy to do. Black and White had more than a few bits of unfinished business in its story arc, things that a 3rd version could have concluded, but that a sequel could handle much more thoroughly. And being a whole sequel could also easily fix many of the major complaints people had about the originals. In hindsight, it all made perfect sense, but nobody at the time even thought it to be a possibility. Literally, The Black Swan Theory. Now, that was a lot for just one game's codename, but I promise none of the others will be quite as long. Let's group together these three: Poké-Transporter, Pokémon Bank, and Pokémon Home. They are less games and more so Pokémon transfer and storage applications, but they were codenamed Salmon, Turtle, and Mega Turtle. Salmon are famous for living in freshwater rivers before migrating out to the ocean, before then migrating back at the end of their lives to lay eggs and start the cycle all over again. Most fish are completely incapable of transferring between fresh and salt water, and since Poké-Transporter's whole deal was transporting Pokémon, naming the project after an animal that famously does the same makes sense. And oh, the thrill of Pokémon storage applications. Going from Pokémon Bank's Turtle to Home's Mega Turtle is easy to figure out. Home is really just Bank again, only significantly more upgraded, hence it being the Mega version. But why Turtle? Well, a turtle's shell is often colloquially referred to as its home. Turtles are slow because they carry their homes everywhere is something I've heard a few times growing up. But other than that, a turtle's shell is a symbol of protection and stability, which really is one of the main reasons one would use Pokémon Bank or Home, rather than just storing your Pokémon in the in-game PC storage box. Your save data can become corrupted or deleted by a sibling. Your game cartridge could be lost. Not to mention, this would mean all of your Pokémon are stored in various games scattered about your bedroom. Bank and later Home brings stability. They are all in one place, and they bring protection since they are all backed up onto the cloud. The project that led to Pokémon X and Y was codenamed Kujira. Translated from Japanese, Kujira means whale. It seems that Game Freak at the time had a penchant for codenames relating to aquatic creatures. But Pokémon X and Y was the biggest project Game Freak had ever done at that point. Not only was there a whole new region with new Pokémon to make, but they had to make it along with all new 3D models of every single Pokémon. Up until this point, Game Freak's Pokémon had only been sprites, as the 3D polygonal entries like Stadium and XD were primarily developed by other studios, and those games didn't have over 720 Pokémon to model, texture, rig, and animate. X and Y was a whale of a project for sure. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were codenamed Sango during development, Sango being Japanese for coral, though notably, San on its own means 3, and these games are remakes of the Generation 3 games Ruby and Sapphire. Also, when written differently, Sango can also mean bright, clear, radiant, and serene, which is exactly how many would describe the waters around the subtropical Kyushu, the region of Japan which inspired Hoenn in these games, which is also famous for the many coral reefs around their islands. So this codename is simple, yet complex. Pokémon GO was codenamed Holo Holo, which is Hawaiian for to go for a walk, or to go for a ride. Pretty self-explanatory there, as the whole point of this game was to get Pokémon fans to go for a walk and touch grass. Though interestingly, it came out in the same year as Pokémon Sun and Moon, which take place in Alola, which is inspired by Hawaii. Perhaps why a Hawaiian word was chosen. Yet, Pokémon Sun and Moon themselves were codenamed Niji, a Japanese word, though a Japanese word that still relates to Hawaii. Niji means rainbow, and rainbows are a major symbol in Hawaii, to the point where automobile license plates feature them, as well as the state nickname, the Aloha State. Aloha being Hawaiian for hello and goodbye, as well as being where this Pokemon region's name comes from. Yet, it's deeper than even that. Rainbows depict the entire light spectrum, and light is a prevailing theme throughout these games and their pseudo-sequels, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Not only are the Sun and Moon the primary bringers of light during the day and night respectively, and not only are the legendary trio in these games the Light Trio, but also the antagonist Pokemon of said trio, Necrozma, is a light prism and prison. Light prisms refract white light in a way that breaks it up into a rainbow quite beautifully, while Necrozma itself is a devourer of light. It traps and consumes it all. The alternate dimension we visit, Ultra Megalopolis, is in a world where Necrozma successfully stole all of the natural light. No more sun, no more moon, no more natural rainbows. Also, Necrozma's face is a rainbow of prism shards. Oh yes, and also Rainbow Rocket in the Ultra games. And yet, those pseudo-sequels, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, used a totally different codename. This time, Momiji. Hey, that's the name of my favorite local sushi chain. Momiji is Japanese for maple leaves specifically, but also deciduous leaves in autumn broadly. Hence the fully evolved grass starter in this game being named Decidui. It's also ghost type, and deciduous leaves are the ones that die in autumn and winter. But their deaths are beautiful, aren't they? Symbolically, Momiji can mean beautiful change, which is really fitting, isn't it? Hawaii and rainbows are beautiful, first of all, but also, rather than a sequel that continues the story of the first one, these Ultra games take place in a different parallel dimension where a lot of things are the same. It takes place at the exact same time, after all, but things are changed. It's different. There are different Pokémon, some characters have different personalities, and there's a whole different story arc on top of the various more subtle changes everywhere. Beautiful changes. Momiji. Pokémon Quest is probably the easiest of all of them with its codename Voxel. It's literally a voxel-based game with a voxel-based art style, voxels being the 3D equivalent to a pixel. Very easy, but not as easy as taking tasty vitamins that your body will actually absorb thanks to this video's sponsor, Gruns. Did you know some supplement companies just throw everything they can in there to just say that it has it? They don't even care that some vitamins completely counteract each other. Magnesium and calcium, for instance, you take both and you get neither. Some vitamins are even dangerous at high levels, but that 900% of your daily value on the bottle sure looks tempting. But stop. Have a Gruns instead. It's not a multivitamin, a green gummy, or a probiotic because it's all three. And they turn boring supplementation into something to look forward to. Did you know that drinking water with your supplements decreases their effectiveness? So in general, gummy vitamins are the way to go. Plus, Gruns are methylated, a process many vitamin companies don't bother with. In short, it means the vitamins inside have 4 extra atoms attached to them, which gives your body a much easier time holding on to and using them properly instead of just peeing them out. Did you know that about 30% of people have the MTHFR mutation, making their body struggle to use non-methylated vitamins whatsoever? With Gruns, you don't have to worry about that, and right now, by using my link at the top of this video's description, you can get up to 45% off. Now, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee was codenamed Beluga. Huh. These games are a return to Kanto, but simplified greatly, utilizing Pokémon GO catching mechanics and reducing the number of battle complications. These games also heavily focused on companionship with either Pikachu or Eevee, and were also the first mainline Pokémon games to feature local co-op gameplay. From the get-go, it was very much intended to be the kind of game that an adult who grew up with Pokémon would use to introduce Pokémon to their own child. It was never supposed to be a serious entry, rather than an inherently playful one, which happens to be what belugas often symbolize in astrology and other forms of spirituality. Belugas are symbols of purity and playfulness, friendship, communication and intuition, adaptability, and nurturing energy, all of which I think work. So Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is in this list for some reason. I guess Game Freak is in the credits to that game, and likely would have had to approve the Pokemon appearances in it. It is simply codenamed Cross 2. Crossovers are the main focus of the Smash Bros. Series after all, and this is likely the second or third time they've used Cross as a codename. Pokemon Masters was codenamed Kenya, as in the East African country, which I'm certainly flabbergasted about. Notably, in other documentation found in this leak, we know that at first, Pokemon Masters was supposed to take place in an Italy-inspired region, but Game Freak later told them not to do that, as Italy is perfect for a potential future Pokemon region in a mainline game. So instead, in Masters, we explore the fictional island of Pasio. This wouldn't be the first time Kenya is used in a Pokemon game, though. In Pokemon Gold and Silver, an NPC named Webster will give you a Spearow named Kenya holding some mail for you to deliver to his friend. So Kenya here is almost acting as a carrier pigeon. Funny it's a Spearow instead of a Pidgey. Perhaps this relates to the point of Pokemon Masters, as it's more focused on the trainers themselves and how they interact with one another rather than just with their Pokemon. I'm not too convinced of that though. The Japanese name of Stefan in the anime was Kenyan, and his first Pokemon was Blitzel, who is a zebra, who are common in Kenya and Ethiopia. Not sure how Stefan relates to this though. Well, the etymology of Kenya could be noteworthy, but it simply means mountain of whiteness, referring to Mount Kenya, the second highest mountain in Africa. Is Pokemon Masters EX a mountain of whiteness? Perhaps. I definitely turn to you for this one. Why do you think? Moving on to Sword and Shield, we see the codename Orion, and honestly, a better constellation could not have been chosen. Orion was a hero, a warrior, and a hunter, and different interpretations have him wielding different objects, but he always has a weapon and a defensive animal skin. A sword and a shield, in a way, which directly relates to the Galarian kings as heroes, depicted similarly throughout the games. Now, the Sword and Shield expansion pass, featuring the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra, was a project all on its own, and thus had its own codename too, Rigel. Not a very common word, but one that relates back to the Orion constellation. The star, named Rigel, is not only Orion's foot in the constellation, but it is also one of the brightest stars in the sky, making it particularly noteworthy. Perhaps it's saying the expansion pass is the finishing touch on these games, the icing on the cake, the cherry on top, as it were. Rigel does get all the attention due to its brightness after all. Rigel is also an Arabic name, which means foot. Naming a child after a foot may seem rude, but it's symbolically sound. It brings to mind the importance of having a strong foundation, and reminds us to always put our best foot forward as we grow and find our place in the world. Perhaps relating to us raising Cubchoo into an Urshifu and helping Calyrex regain his footing in this DLC. Pokemon Cafe was codenamed Tart. Cafes sell tarts. Pokémon Mezastar is not a game I'd expect you to know. It is a Japan-only arcade game that uses physical peripherals to operate Pokémon battles. These things. Though the development codename being Wiener, I can't say anything jumps out at me beyond the obvious. They sure are wieners for not bringing this outside of Japan, and they knew it! The tags you buy to play the game are vaguely wiener-shaped. Chody little Vienna sausages. Actually, the word wiener comes from Vienna. It's a mispronunciation that became more prolific than the correct one. And Vienna is the capital and largest city of Austria. And we all know Japan had quite a little shindig with an Austrian not too long ago. So is there anything Austrian here related to this? Well, yes, actually, believe it or not. You know Amiibo, and those Amiibo cards, and even the Pokemon Rumble figurines? They work thanks to the NFC chips inside them, and NFC chips were invented by an Austrian. One problem though, while this Mezastar game functions similarly to Amiibo in concept, you place a little plastic thing on top of a scanner to do in-game stuff, this arcade machine does so via tiny QR codes instead of NFC chips. But I've got a theory here. That may not have been the plan originally. They could have gone into this project thinking of using the Austrian tech that lets Amiibo work, but through development they realized that just printing a QR code on a sticker is a lot cheaper than putting NFC chips in every tag. It makes it easier to cheat, but how many kids are actually going to do that? To add some credence to that theory, a sort of sequel arcade game, Pokemon Frenda, also uses tags like this. Only they actually use NFC chips in the tags. Better than cheaping out, it turns out. Pokemon Unite was codenamed Nishiki, which is Japanese for brocade. A brocade being a rather luxurious fabric with a raised pattern, often using gold or silver thread. This may relate to Unite's gameplay goals. Being a MOBA, the team who is most close-knit and organized in going through the thin, winding pathways is usually going to be the victor. Look at the stadiums within Unite beside some brocades. The path layouts are like the winding yet symmetrical intricacies of the fabric. Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were supposed to be remasters of the 4th generation Pokemon games. While made by a different studio, ICLA, Game Freak still had say over them, including giving them the project's codename Delphi. To the ancient Greeks, Delphi was a holy and sacred place where oracles would communicate with gods to help people make important decisions. It was thought to be one of the closest areas to the gods, and perhaps where humans were originally birthed. As the ancient Greek word for womb, Delphis or Delphis pulls from the same roots. This, of course, relates to the mythology surrounding Spear Pillar, which lays atop Mount Coronet in these very games. It is said that when Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia created the region, they started at Spear Pillar, where now there are Greek-styled ruins. Actually, some of the ruins in Pokemon Legends Arceus look strikingly similar to the ruins at Delphi. This game takes place in the same region, though more than 100 years in the past, and its development codename Hayabusa, which is the Japanese name for the Japanese peregrine falcon, the fastest animal in Japan, and one who symbolizes their status and warrior spirit. Falconry in Japan was very popular among nobles and samurai from as early as the 16th century and peaked around the early 19th century, approximately when these games take place. But also, falcons from around the world have always been symbols of freedom and vision, lining up well with Legends Arceus being the first Pokémon game of its kind, one that's significantly more open-ended and free. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet was codenamed Titan, as we've already talked about, but like Sword and Shield's expansion pass, the DLC for Scarlet and Violet was considered a separate project. Before the name The Hidden Treasure of Area Zero was decided upon, it was codenamed Sudachi, which are small green citrus fruits grown in Japan and can be used in place of lemons, limes, or even vinegar due to how strong its flavor can be. It is a very traditional Japanese ingredient, harvested in the late summer to early autumn and often being used to make ponzu sauce. This may be all we need, as the first part of the Hidden Treasure DLC takes us to the Kitakami region during their summer festival, and Kitakami is clearly one of, if not the, most traditionally Japanese regions we've seen in this franchise. Also notable, one of the legendary Pokémon this DLC introduces, Ogerpon, is a cross between a Japanese Oni and a small citrus tree. Pokémon Sleep, being called Moe in development, is pretty cute, honestly. Moe is a Japanese slang term that grew into mainstream use in the 90s through the early 2000s. It specifically refers to feelings of affection, adoration, and even excitement towards anime and video game characters, most often the cute ones. So, a fictional Japanese character whose primary defining characteristic is being cute is Moe. And what is Pokémon Sleep if not the cutest little Pokémon spin-off app you've ever seen? It's like seeing your adorable pet take a nap. It's inherently cute, first and foremost. Rodeo is the code name for an action-based Pokémon game that was cancelled before it was ever shown to the public. But what little information we got from it in the Teraleak points out that Rodeo is the perfect code name. The primary mechanic of this game was riding your Pokémon while battling and catching others. Rodeos themselves are cowboy activity tournaments, and tie-down roping is one of the big ones. The cowboy rides his horse and catches a calf with a lasso. Now, before we get to the last three code names on this list, here is your spoiler warning. Thanks to the Teraleak, we have the code names of 3 yet-to-be-released Pokémon games, including Pokémon Legends ZA, the Generation 10 games, and another spin-off. If you don't want to hear my speculation about them, as I might be 100% perfectly correct and thus spoil everything, then you should go. But thanks for watching this far. You're excellent. Might I suggest our other videos covering the leaked beta Pokémon? Alright, now let's get to it. We know that Pokémon Legends ZA has that as its final name, takes place in Lumio City in Kalos, and features Zygarde. But up until ZA was settled upon as the name, it was internally referred to as Ikaku, which is the Japanese name for the narwhal. Remember, Pokémon X and Y, the original games to feature Lumio City and Zygarde, was codenamed Kujira, meaning whale, so Legends ZA being another whale is quite fitting. Narwhals are, of course, most famous for their long central horns, which are actually tusks, and that may play a role too. Back when ZA was announced, I theorized that it may take place during Haussmann's renovation of Paris, which happened only slightly after the Meiji Restoration, when Japan modernized and colonized Hokkaido, roughly the time period Pokémon Legends Arceus took place, and in the same location. Paris, of course, is the city that Lumiose is based on, and when the renovation started, they destroyed, just entire city blocks, all of downtown, specifically so that they could rebuild the entire city better and with more beauty. And towards the end of the project, they began the construction of the world-famous Eiffel Tower, a point in the center of the city for all to see, not unlike the point in the central of a narwhal. Synapse is the code name for another Pokémon spin-off game being co-developed by Game Freak, ICLA of Brilliant Diamond fame, and the Pokémon Company, which, according to the leaker, is a very Splatoon-like multiplayer game with Pokémon. Very little was shared about it, but I think the codename Synapse was chosen for similar reasons to Unite being Nishiki, again, Japanese for brocade. A synapse is the junction point between two neurons in the brain that allows them to communicate, and surely any MMO-style action game is going to require a lot of communication between the team players, as well as their consoles and the server through the internet. But perhaps the game design itself will also be reflective of synapses too, the maps resembling the complicated intricacies of neurons, though we'll have to wait and see. Same with the Gen 10 games, though some was shared about it in the Teraleak. Supposedly it involves many tiny islands, like an archipelago. Also, the individual games are currently named K and N, and the overall project's codename is Gaia. Gaia is the personification of the Earth itself in Greek mythology, the mother of all life, Mother Nature. Could this be the theme of the legendaries? It would be fitting after Legend ZA, as Zygarde is the guardian of the ecosystem, the protector of Gaia, in a way, and Gaia being Greek, and the game involving lots of tiny islands. I mean, have you seen a map of Greece? That's a lot of tiny islands. I have read a lot of differing opinions speculating about where Gen 10 is going to be based, but this is the one I am most convinced by, though it has some points against it. The biggest being, well, Gen 9 took place in Iberia, which is also a Mediterranean region, so the environments would be pretty identical, at least on the mainland. There could very well be a whole Wind Waker-like exploration system. Perhaps it will even bring back the diving mechanic from Generation 3 and expand upon it. That would do more than enough to differentiate it from Paldea, which barely did anything with water. With this speculative seafaring Greek region in mind, could the names being labeled K and N be for Kaze and Nami, Japanese for wave and wind, the biggest ways classical boats travel? Would the box legendaries be an electric Zeus and watery Poseidon? Would these games' names in the West be Wave and Wind, or Sea and Sky? And since both of those things are blue, and Pokemon games have always been a shade of red with a shade of blue, would the sea be the red one, as many cultures in the ancient world did not differentiate red from blue, leading to the famous quote from the Iliad, "Wine-faced sea," describing the Mediterranean as the color of red wine? It's all speculative, and speculation potentially never ends, so I'm just gonna end it here before I get too into it. What are your thoughts? Let me know below, never stop using your noggin, and be sure to check out Gruns with the link below to get 45% off and get some good and tasty vitamins. Thanks for watching.